Hi, the topic that we'll be discussing is songs as an aid for language acquisition.
So why the interest in songs?
Firstly, we know that songs can spark certain emotional responses and grab our attention. Secondly, we know that pitch is relevant in music, but it's also relevant in language acquisition as we know that syllable change and pitch change go hand in hand. So the hypothesis was that mapping linguistic and musical information together would serve as an aid for learning to segment speech. So we know that transitional probabilities are responsible for speech segmentation. Simply put, this means the probability of event Y happening given that event X has already occurred. Putting this in the context of language acquisition means identifying word boundaries by figuring out the probability of a certain syllable following another. The probability will always be higher when the two adjacent syllables are within a word and lower when the two adjacent sounds have a word boundary in between. In the example of pretty baby, the probability of pre being followed by T is much higher than T being followed by be. Many experiments, such as that of Saffron and colleagues, have proven that children are able to compute these regularities and use them to segment speech. Now let's discuss the methods of the study at hand. Let's begin with the first experiment. 26 native French-speaking adults were presented with a continuous stream of 7 minutes of 6 three-syllable nonsense words. The transitional probabilities within words range from 0.31 to 1, while the transitional probabilities across boundaries were lower and ranged from 0.1 to 0.2. The participants were instructed to simply listen to these string of words. Then the participants were presented with strings of words that were either words from the artificial language or part words. The participants were instructed to press one of two buttons to indicate which string sounded most like it came from the artificial language they were being exposed to. So what is a part word? The part words were created by either attaching the last syllable of a word plus the first syllable pair of another word, or the last syllable pair of a word plus the first syllable of another word. In this example, you can see that the last syllable of the first word, which is sisipi, is attached to the first syllable pair of the next word, which is sipigi, and it creates pisipi. We can see how this tests to see if people have segmented the words properly, because in a continuous stream, these two words occurring next to each other could lead to the extraction of this part word. In the second experiment, we have the same exact setup, except in this case, the words are sung in audio. There were 11 tones, and each tone was paired with a syllable, so each syllable only occurred with one tone. As you can see here, the syllable outline in bold occurs with the same tone every time. Everything remained the same in the third experiment, except this time each syllable didn't occur with the same exact tone every time. This photo here illustrates the difference between the second experiment and the third experiment. You can see here that the syllable outlined in dashed lines is not sung in the same tone each time. This eliminates the participant's ability to use melody as a means of segmenting speech. So the only factor that can be at play here is the attention-grabbing factor of having those words be sung to the participants. Now that we've talked about all the experiments, let's discuss the results of each. In the first experiment that had no musical elements, the participants were unable to segment the words in this artificial language properly. This may be surprising since the infants in Saffron's experiment were able to do this. However, they had 21 minutes of exposure, while the adults in this study only had 7 minutes. In the second experiment, the participants learned the words with 64% accuracy. The performance in the third experiment was better than the performance in the first experiment with only plain speech, and worse than the performance in the second experiment with one-to-one correspondence between syllable and tone. These experiments tell us that we can acquire language and identify word boundaries in a shorter amount of time when some musical elements are involved, especially if those musical elements are repetitive. We also found that the emotional arousal that songs invoke alone can be an aid in language acquisition. So, when trying to learn a new language, songs can be beneficial because of our emotional responses to them, and if they have repetitive structures, they would be even more beneficial.